January 1967, New Haven, Connecticut. The machine stopped, not gradually, not with warning. All at once the presses went cold, the conveyor belts went still, and the bolts, millions of tiny steel bolts, sat in their bins untouched for the first time in 54 years. The workers walked out of Erector Square and didn't come back. The company that had put a steel construction set under every American Christmas tree, the company that had turned 5,000 New Haven families into middle-class households, the company that during the space race was shipping science kits to the children who would grow up to build the rockets. Gone. Bankrupt. Dissolved. At its peak, A.C. Gilbert employed more people than any other employer in New Haven. 30 million Erector sets had already sold. 50 million would eventually carry the brand. A Yale-educated Olympic Gold Medalist had built it from a cardboard prototype on a dining room table. So how does something like that disappear? The answer isn't cheap imports. It isn't bad luck. It's a story about what happens when the wrong people inherit something extraordinary, and what America lost when they did. To understand what A.C. Gilbert built, you first have to understand who A.C. Gilbert was, because in the entire history of American manufacturing, it is difficult to find a founder quite like him. Alfred Carlton Gilbert was born in Salem, Oregon, in 1884. From the beginning, he was the kind of person who made other people feel slightly inadequate just by existing. As a teenager, he set the world record for consecutive chin-ups. He was a speed-bag boxer good enough to perform in the circus. He was a trained magician who could work a crowd as well as any professional. And when he decided he wanted to compete in track and field, he didn't dabble. He became one of the best pole vaulters in the world. In 1908, Alfred Carlton Gilbert traveled to London and tied for the gold medal in pole vault at the Summer Olympics. Then he came home and enrolled in medical school at Yale. He earned his medical degree in 1909. He never practiced medicine. He'd think what he did instead was borrow $5,000 from his father and start a company making magic kits for children. His partner was a man named John Petrie. Their company was called the Misto Manufacturing Company, and it operated out of Westville, Connecticut, in a space barely large enough to hold the two of them. Most people, looking at that biography, would call the magic company the backup plan. For Gilbert, it was the beginning. What set Gilbert apart from other entrepreneurs of his era wasn't talent. Plenty of talented men built companies and watched them fail. What set him apart was a belief, genuine and deeply held, that his work mattered beyond the bottom line. Gilbert didn't think of himself as a toy manufacturer. He thought of himself as someone building the next generation of American engineers. Every Erector set, every chemistry kit, every microscope set that left his factory was, in his mind, a recruiting tool for the future of the country. That conviction shaped everything about how he ran his company. He punched the time clock every morning alongside his factory workers. He stood in the same cafeteria line. He offered his employees paid maternity leave and partial health insurance, at a time when most American manufacturers considered such things radical. When a worker had a birthday, Gilbert made a point of finding them on the floor and shaking their hand personally. Dominic Preditz, who worked as a shipping supervisor at Erector Square for 15 years, remembered it clearly decades later. Gilbert, he said, was a very pleasant and smart man. He never talked down to you. That detail matters. Because the culture Gilbert built inside that factory was not accidental. It was a direct extension of his personality, and it is precisely what made the company's eventual collapse so devastating to the people who depended on it. By the time Gilbert retired in 1954, he had spent 45 years building something that New Haven had come to regard as permanent. The factory on Peck Street wasn't just an employer, it was a landmark, a source of civic pride, a place where a working-class family could put children through school and own a home and feel, without exaggeration, that they were part of something that mattered to the whole country. He titled his autobiography, "The Man Who Lives in Paradise." Reading that title in 1967, standing outside the locked gates of Erector Square, the workers who had given their careers to A.C. Gilbert might have chosen different words. But in 1954, when Gilbert handed the company to his son and walked away, none of that darkness was visible yet. The factory was humming. The orders were coming in. The country was prosperous. The baby boom was producing customers as fast as the presses could stamp steel, and it seemed entirely reasonable to believe that the best years were still ahead. They were not. Vid Egrisset did not begin in a laboratory. It did not begin with a team of designers or a market research report. It began on a commuter train somewhere between New Haven and New York City in 1911. Gilbert was riding that route when he looked out the window and saw something that stopped him. The New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad was converting its main line to electric power, and along the right-of-way, work crews were erecting steel girders to carry the power lines. Tall, precise, interlocking frameworks of metal rising out of the Connecticut landscape. Gilbert stared at them the way an engineer stares at a problem he suddenly knows how to solve. That night, he and his wife Mary sat at their dining room table and cut miniature girders out of cardboard. They worked through the angles and the spacing, testing proportions with their hands, getting the geometry right. When they were satisfied, Gilbert took the cardboard templates to a local tool maker and asked him to reproduce them in steel. The result, introduced at the New York City Toy Fair in 1913, was called the Misto Erector Structural Steel Builder. The label on the box read, "Educational, instructive, and amusing." It was the only construction toy on the American market that included a working electric motor. Children could build things that moved. It was an immediate sensation. What Gilbert understood, before anyone else in the toy industry understood it, was that American parents in 1913 didn't just want to entertain their children. They wanted to invest in them. The country was industrializing at a pace that made engineering feel like destiny, and Gilbert positioned the Erector set not as a toy but as a training ground. His advertising didn't just target children, it targeted fathers. It told them that the boy who built with Erector sets today would build bridges and factories tomorrow. But the strategy worked beyond any reasonable expectation. By the mid-1930s, more than 30 million Erector sets had been sold across the United States. The company had become the largest toy manufacturer in America and, simultaneously, the largest manufacturer of fractional horsepower motors in the country, holding the patent on enameled wire, the component that made those small motors possible. Gilbert didn't stop at Erector sets. Chemistry sets followed in 1922, their instruction manuals co-edited by a Sterling, professor of organic chemistry at Yale. Microscope sets came in 1935. In 1938, Gilbert purchased the struggling American Flyer model train company out of Chicago, moved production to New Haven, and rebuilt the line from the ground up. By the 1950s, American Flyer had become Gilbert's single largest selling product. In 1950, Gilbert released the U-2038 Atomic Energy Laboratory, a kit containing a Geiger counter, a cloud chamber, and actual uranium-bearing ore samples. It retailed for $49.50. The instructions suggested playing hide-and-seek, using the radioactive samples and the Geiger counter to find them. The government shut down production the following year. In 2006, it was named one of the 10 most dangerous toys ever made. Even Gilbert's failures were extraordinary. By the time the 1950s arrived, the factory on Peck Street was one of the most recognizable industrial addresses in New England. The neighborhood had taken on the name Erector Square. Children across the country knew the red metal boxes with the steel parts inside, the way a later generation would know a video game cartridge. By feel, by smell, by the specific weight of possibility when you lifted the lid. That recognition was the company's greatest asset. It was also, in the end, the thing that made it hardest to see what was coming. The country was prosperous. The baby boom was producing customers as fast as the presses could stamp steel, and it seemed entirely reasonable to believe that the best years were still ahead. They were not. In the winter of 1918, Alfred Carlton Gilbert did something that no toy manufacturer had ever done before, and that no toy manufacturer has had to do since. He walked into a room full of the most powerful government officials in the United States and argued that children's happiness was essential to the war effort. He won. The context matters. America had entered World War I, and the Council of National Defense, the body tasked with mobilizing the country's industrial capacity, was considering a sweeping ban on the manufacture of non-essential goods. Toys were on the list. The logic was straightforward. Factories making Erector sets could be making munitions instead. The raw materials going into chemistry sets could be going into weapons. Christmas, the council suggested, could wait. Gilbert had already complied with every previous request. He had retooled parts of his operation to support the war effort. He had promoted war bonds. He had done what was asked. But the proposed toy ban was different. He believed, with the kind of conviction that tends to make bureaucrats uncomfortable, that it was wrong. He requested a hearing before the council in Washington, D.C. Then he packed a suitcase full of toys and carried it into the room. What followed became one of the more remarkable scenes in American business history. Gilbert stood before the council and made his case, not on economic grounds, but on human ones. He argued that the morale of American families, the mothers at home, the fathers at the front, and above all the children waiting for Christmas, was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. A country that couldn't maintain the spirit of its own people was a country that couldn't sustain a war. He opened the suitcase. He showed them the toys. The council reversed the proposed ban. The press gave Gilbert a nickname that would follow the company for the rest of its existence: the man who saved Christmas. He was elected the first president of the newly formed Toy Manufacturers of America, a trade organization that exists in updated form to this day. It is worth pausing on what that moment represented. In 1918, A.C. Gilbert stood in front of the United States government and successfully argued that play was not frivolous, that the instinct to build, to explore, to put things together and take them apart was something worth protecting even in wartime, especially in wartime. That argument was, in miniature, the entire philosophy of his company. The erector set was not a distraction from serious life. It was preparation for it. Chemistry sets did not compete with education. They were education. The factory on Peck Street was not just producing toys. It was producing, in Gilbert's own framing, the engineers and scientists that America would need for the next generation. History would validate that claim more directly than Gilbert could have imagined. The children who built with erector sets in the 1930s and 1940s were the engineers who built the infrastructure of post-war America. The children who received chemistry sets in the 1950s were among the scientists who staffed the laboratories of the space race. The man who saved Christmas in 1918 was, in a very literal sense, helping to build the America of 1969. His factory would not survive long enough to see it. The country was prosperous. The baby boom was producing customers as fast as the presses could stamp steel, and it seemed entirely reasonable to believe that the best years were still ahead. They were not. In 1923, A.C. Gilbert moved his entire operation to Peck Street in New Haven. What he built there over the following 3 decades was not just a factory. It was a small city inside a city. The complex eventually spread across 8 buildings. The production lines ran 3 shifts. At its peak, from the early 1930s through the late 1850s, the A.C. Gilbert Company employed as many as 5,000 people, the single largest employer in New Haven. Entire neighborhoods within walking distance of Peck Street were populated almost entirely by Gilbert workers and their families. The factory wasn't a place those families depended on. It was the organizing principle of their lives. Inside the buildings, the scale of what was being produced was staggering. Steel was stamped, drilled, painted, and packaged into erective sets. Peak-action motors, small, precise, enameled wire motors that Gilbert's company manufactured under its own patents, were assembled by hand and fitted into boxes destined for Christmas trees across the country. American flyer trains moved along test tracks on the upper floors. Chemistry sets were packed with compounds measured by workers who knew the contents well enough to mix them safely without looking at the labels. Microscope kits, telescope kits, tool sets, and magic sets flowed through parallel lines in adjacent buildings. Gilbert also made home appliances. Mixers, toasters, fans, and washing machines carried the Gilbert name. The company held over 150 patents. It operated its own radio station, WCJ, the first broadcasting station licensed in the state of Connecticut, before being forced to shut it down after a legal dispute with Westinghouse. On Peck Street, there was a factory cafeteria where the founder stood in line with his workers every morning. There was a dairy herd on Gilbert's personal farm that supplied the cafeteria with milk. There were birthday handshakes from the man whose name was on the building. There was paid maternity leave when no one else in the industry was offering it. There was a culture, deliberately built and carefully maintained, that told every person on that floor that their work was meaningful, that the thing they were assembling and boxing and shipping was going to matter to some child somewhere in America. The neighborhood itself absorbed the company's identity. Residents called it Erector Square, long before any sign made it official. Local businesses calibrated their hours to the factory shifts. The rhythm of Peck Street was the rhythm of the Gilbert workday. In 1941, Gilbert opened the Gilbert Hall of Science in New York City, part working museum, part product showroom, part monument to the idea that science belonged to everyone. Additional halls of science followed in Chicago and Washington, D.C. During World War II, Building 1 on Peck Street was retooled to manufacture parachutes for the military. When the war ended, the presses went back to stamping steel girders, and the orders resumed as if nothing had interrupted them. For the workers inside Erector Square in 1950, looking around at the humming lines and the full order books, and the founder still punching his time card at the front gate, the future must have seemed self-evident. What none of them could see was that the ground had already begun to shift beneath them, quietly, irreversibly, in living rooms across America, where a new piece of furniture had just arrived and plugged itself into the wall. The country was prosperous. The baby boom was producing customers as fast as the presses could stamp steel, and it seemed entirely reasonable to believe that the best years were still ahead. They were not. The television set arrived in the American living room like a polite guest that never left. In 1950, fewer than 10% of American households owned one. By 1960, nearly 90% did. That single statistic, a technology penetrating 9 out of 10 homes in a single decade, represents one of the fastest cultural transformations in the country's history, and almost nobody in the toy industry understood, in real time, what it meant. Gilbert understood it least of all, not because he was slow, because he was too certain. For 40 years, the Erector set had sold itself on a simple proposition. A child's hands were the most powerful tool in the room. You built something, it worked. And the satisfaction of that was self-reinforcing. No batteries required beyond the small motor in the larger sets. No screen, no passive consumption. Just steel, bolts, a wrench, and a diagram of something you were going to make real. Television inverted that proposition completely. It told children that the most exciting thing in the room was the thing they weren't touching. Walt Disney's weekly broadcast began in 1954, the same year Gilbert handed the company to his son. Within months, it was drawing audiences of 40 million viewers. Children who might have spent a Saturday afternoon building a Ferris wheel out of steel girders were instead sitting in front of a screen, watching Davy Crockett. A historian standing outside the former Erector Square factory would later compress the entire shift into 3 words. Disney happened. People stopped making and started watching. The damage to Gilbert's business model was not immediate. The late 1950s were still profitable years. The space race provided a secondary surge. Sputnik launched in October 1957, and suddenly every American parent wanted their son to be an engineer. Gilbert rushed out a line of reflector telescopes to catch the wave. He commissioned a comic book, Adventures in Science, featuring a character called Mr. Science, who traveled through time, interesting a bored teenage boy in the wonders of the physical world. Chemistry sets were repackaged with space-age graphics. The marketing pivoted hard toward rockets and satellites and the boys who would someday build them. But pivoting the marketing did not address the underlying problem. The underlying problem was that the product itself, beautifully engineered, precisely manufactured, deeply serious, required something that television was systematically training American children not to do. It required patience. It required sustained attention. It required the willingness to follow a diagram through 30 steps before the thing you were building looked like anything at all. Television offered gratification in 30-second increments. The Erector set asked for an afternoon. That gap widened every year. There were other pressures accumulating alongside it. Cheap plastic toys were beginning to arrive from overseas manufacturers who could produce at a fraction of Gilbert's cost. The red metal boxes with the precision-stamped steel parts inside were expensive to make and expensive to buy. A family choosing between a Gilbert Erector set and 3 plastic toys from a discount bin was increasingly choosing volume over quality. Gilbert's entire brand identity, American-made, precision-engineered, built to last a generation, was becoming a liability in a market that was learning to prefer disposable and immediate. The company's response to these pressures was, in retrospect, dangerously passive. The product line was not fundamentally redesigned. The manufacturing process was not restructured to reduce costs. The advertising continued to speak to fathers about engineering careers at a moment when the children those fathers were trying to reach were already in front of the television watching cartoons. A.C. Gilbert Sr. had built the company on the conviction that quality would always justify itself. That belief had been correct for 40 years. It was now becoming a form of institutional blindness. When Gilbert retired in 1954, he handed his son a company that was still profitable, still respected, and still producing extraordinary products. He also handed him a company that was standing perfectly still while the world accelerated past it. His son would spend the next 7 years trying to catch up. He would run out of time before he could. Alfred Carlton Gilbert Jr. was not his father. That is not a criticism. It is simply a fact that shaped everything that followed. The son had his father's name and his father's Yale degree, engineering, class of 1941. He had spent the war years as a design engineer for naval ordnance at General Electric in Schenectady. He understood manufacturing, he understood precision. He joined the family company in 1946, worked his way through the roles of secretary and treasurer, and took over as president in 1954 when his father stepped back. By every conventional measure, A.C. Gilbert Jr. was a capable man. He was president of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce. He sat on the board of the Second National Bank. He had organized the Junior Achievement Movement in New Haven and served as its president. He was, in the language of his era, a pillar of the community. What he was not was his father's kind of visionary. And so think. And in the mid-1950s, with television reshaping American childhood and plastic imports undercutting American manufacturing and the entire toy industry accelerating into unfamiliar territory, the company needed exactly that. Gilbert Jr. saw the problems clearly enough. The order books that had once filled themselves were requiring more effort to maintain. The plastic toys arriving from overseas were pulling customers toward price points that Erector Square could not match. Television advertising was becoming the dominant channel for reaching children, and television advertising was expensive in a way that print campaigns had never been. The company's cost structure, built around American labor and precision metal manufacturing, was being stress-tested by a market that was moving in the opposite direction. His responses were reasonable. They were also insufficient. He expanded the product line, adding powered airplanes and new science kits. Thing leaned into the space race marketing that briefly lifted sales in the late 1950s. He kept the factory running and the workers employed and the Christmas shipments going out on schedule. He was president of the Toy Manufacturers of the United States in 1963, the same organization his father had helped found, which spoke to the respect he commanded within the industry. But the company was slowing, not collapsing, slowing, the kind of deceleration that is easy to rationalize quarter by quarter and deeply dangerous when viewed across a decade. Then, in 1961, A.C. Gilbert Sr. died, January 24th. He was 76 years old. The founder's death did something to the company that no balance sheet could capture. Gilbert Sr. had been the living argument for everything the company believed about itself. His presence, his philosophy, his handshakes on the factory floor, his absolute certainty that engineering toys mattered, had held the culture together even after his formal retirement. Only he died. That argument died with him. The family, facing the company's deteriorating financial position and the growing complexity of navigating a rapidly changing toy market, made a decision. They sold controlling interests to the Rather Corporation of Los Angeles. The deal closed in December 1961. Jack Rather was an entertainment mogul. He owned the Lassie television franchise, he owned the Lone Ranger brand, he owned a chain of hotels. He was skilled at managing intellectual property and leisure brands, and he believed that the A.C. Gilbert Company was fundamentally a brand management problem, that what it needed was not better engineering, but better positioning within the entertainment economy that television had created. He was not entirely wrong about the diagnosis. He was catastrophically wrong about the cure. A.C. Gilbert Jr. stayed on, first as board chairman after the Rather takeover, then cycling back to president during a financial reorganization. He was caught between the culture his father had built and the new ownership's commercial imperatives, trying to hold together a company that was pulling in two directions at once. He did not have long to try. On June 27, 1964, A.C. Gilbert Jr. died in Grace New Haven Community Hospital. He was 44 years old, 2 family deaths in 3 years. The founder, gone. The heir, gone. The factory on Peck Street still running. But now, in the hands of men who had never stood on its floor, never shaken a worker's hand on a birthday, never believed, not really, not the way the Gilberts had believed, that what was being made inside those buildings mattered beyond its price point. The last chapter had begun. Most of the people inside Erected Square just didn't know it yet. Thank Rather had never made a toy in his life. That fact alone would not have been disqualifying. Plenty of capable executives have managed industries they didn't grow up in. What disqualified Rather, or, more precisely, what made his stewardship of the A.C. Gilbert Company so damaging, was not ignorance of toys. It was a fundamental misreading of what the company actually was. Rather looked at A.C. Gilbert and saw a brand, a name with recognition, a catalog of products, a distribution network, a factory, the things that could be measured, assessed, and repositioned within a broader entertainment portfolio. What he did not see, what he was perhaps constitutionally unable to see, was the culture that had made the brand worth anything in the first place. The philosophy, the conviction, the idea, held with genuine force by the man who built the company, that the point of the entire enterprise was to produce the next generation of American individuals. That idea was not a marketing slogan. It was an operating principle. It had shaped the products, the manufacturing standards, the relationship between management and workers, the decision to open halls of science in 3 cities, the choice to hire a Yale chemistry professor to co-edit the instruction manuals for a children's chemistry set. Strip it out, and what remained was a factory making metal toys in an era when metal toys were losing ground to plastic ones. That was not a promising position. Rather's team set about trying to modernize the company. The diversification strategy that followed was, in retrospect, a monument to solving the wrong problems. In 1965, the company released James Bond tie-in figures and a slot car road race set featuring Bond's Aston Martin DB5. The timing was not unreasonable. The Bond films were a global phenomenon, and slot car racing was briefly one of the hottest categories in the American toy market. But the execution was poor, the sales were disappointing, and the product development resources that went into the Bond line were resources not going into the core erector set and science kit business that still represented the company's identity. The slot car racing market, it turned out, was a bubble. It collapsed almost as quickly as it had inflated, leaving Gilbert holding inventory it could not move and debt it could not easily absorb. Meanwhile, the core business continued its slow deterioration. The halls of science, those extraordinary showrooms that Gilbert Sr. had opened in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., as physical monuments to the idea that science was for everyone, were quietly closed one by one between 1964 and 1966. By the time the last one shut its doors, there was no announcement, no ceremony. They simply stopped opening in the morning. The factory workers on Peck Street felt the change before they could name it. Orders that used to come in automatically now had to be chased. Product lines that had run year-round were being cut to seasonal schedules. Overtime that had been a reliable feature of the October through December rush was reduced, then eliminated. The birthday handshakes from the founder were 3 years gone. The new management was in Los Angeles, making decisions about a New Haven factory from a distance that was not merely geographical. There was a moment, not a single dramatic event, but a gradual, grinding recognition, when the workers at Erector Square understood that the company was in serious trouble. It arrived differently for different people. For some, it was the closure of the Branford facility. For others, it was the thinning of the product catalog, the familiar red boxes disappearing from the line to be replaced by cheaper configurations. For Dominic Prate, the shipping supervisor who had worked alongside the founder and been trusted with the birthday handshake, it was simply the cumulative weight of 100 small changes that added up to one large conclusion. The thing that A.C. Gilbert had built was being disassembled from the inside. And the timing could not have been more painful, because outside the walls of Erector Square, in the summer of 1965, the United States was accelerating its space program toward the moon. NASA was hiring engineers by the thousands. The country was desperate for exactly the kind of technically literate, scientifically curious young men that Gilbert's products had been designed to produce. The Erector set was, at that precise moment in American history, more relevant than it had ever been. The company that made it was 6 months from the edge. In the end, It was not foreign competition that killed A.C. Gilbert. It was not television alone, though television had opened the wound. It was not even Rather's mismanagement, though that mismanagement had prevented the wound from healing. It was all of it together, arriving at once, in a company that had lost the one thing it needed most. The man who had believed in it enough to hold it together was gone, and without that belief, the bolts had nothing left to hold. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit, and the United States had a crisis of confidence that lasted a decade. The reaction was immediate and visceral. If the Soviets could put a satellite in space, the thinking went, they could put a warhead anywhere on Earth. The problem, as Washington identified it with unusual speed, was not military, it was educational. America was not producing enough engineers, not enough physicists, not enough scientists. The pipeline that fed the country's technical capacity was too narrow, and the consequence of that narrowness was now beeping at them from low Earth orbit every 90 minutes. Congress passed the National Defense Education Act in 1958, pouring federal money into science and mathematics education for the first time in American history. Universities expanded their engineering programs. High schools rewrote their curricula. The word STEM did not yet exist, but the concept, the urgent national priority of producing technically literate citizens, was subtly the most important idea in the country. And at the center of that idea, whether Washington recognized it or not, was a factory on Peck Street in New Haven that had been making that argument since 1913. For a brief, luminous moment, the space race was the best thing that had happened to A.C. Gilbert in years. Gilbert Jr. moved quickly. Telescope kits appeared in the catalog. Chemistry sets were repackaged with rocket graphics and space-age language. The marketing copy began speaking directly to the national anxiety. Buy your son a Gilbert science kit and you are buying him a future in the most important industry in the world. It worked. Sales ticked upward. For a few Christmas seasons in the late 1850s and very early 1960s, the Erector set and the science kits rode the Sputnik wave, and the order books filled again. But the wave passed. And, when it passed, it revealed how little had actually changed beneath the surface. Here is the irony that history has never quite given enough weight to. The children who had received Erector sets and chemistry sets and microscope kits in the 1940s and early 1950s, the products of Gilbert's peak manufacturing years, were precisely the generation that staffed NASA's Apollo program. The engineers who designed the Saturn V rocket, who calculated the trajectories, who built the life support systems and the guidance computers and the lunar module, were the boys who had grown up on Peck Street's output. Neil Armstrong was born in 1930, Buzz Aldrin in 1930, Michael Collins in 1930. They were exactly the right age to have received an Erector set at Christmas in the early 1940s, in the years when Gilbert's factory was running all 3 shifts and shipping 30 million units into the American market. The factory that had helped build the Apollo generation was bankrupt before Apollo 11 left the launch pad. It closed in January 1967. The moon landing was July 1969. The margin between those two dates, 2.5 years, is one of the more painful gaps in American industrial history. The company that had spent 54 years arguing that play was preparation, that building toys were nation-building tools, that the boy with the Erector set would grow up to build something that mattered, that company died 2 years before its argument was proven correct on live television, watched by 600 million people around the world. Nobody at the bankruptcy proceedings mentioned Apollo. Nobody needed to. The timing said everything. For Dominic Prate, the shipping supervisor who had worked alongside the founder and been trusted with the birthday handshake, it was simply the cumulative weight of 100 small changes that added up to one large conclusion. The thing that A.C. Gilbert had built was being disassembled from the inside, and the timing could not have been more painful. Because outside the walls of Erector Square, in the summer of 1965, the United States was accelerating its space program toward the moon. NASA was hiring engineers by the thousands. The country was desperate for exactly the kind of technically literate, scientifically curious young men that Gilbert's products had been designed to produce. The Erector set was, at that precise moment in American history, more relevant than it had ever been. The company that made it was 6 months from the edge. In the end, it was not foreign competition that killed A.C. Gilbert. It was not television alone, though television had opened the wound. It was not even Rather's mismanagement, though that mismanagement had prevented the wound from healing. It was all of it together, arriving at once, in a company that had lost the one thing it needed most. The man who had believed in it enough to hold it together was gone, and without that belief, the bolts had nothing left to hold. The last good Christmas was probably 1964. The orders had come in that October as they always did, and the lines at Erector Square had run the extended schedules that the holiday season demanded. The red metal boxes moved through the packaging stations. The Erector sets and the chemistry kits and the American Flyer train sets were loaded onto trucks. And somewhere across the country, children were going to wake up on Christmas morning and find a Gilbert product under the tree. The rhythm was familiar. The execution was professional. The people on the floor knew their jobs and did them. But the numbers underneath that familiar rhythm were telling a different story. The Kennedy assassination in November 1963 had hit the Christmas toy market harder than anyone in the industry had publicly acknowledged. Families in mourning don't shop with enthusiasm. The holiday season of 1963 had been measurably softer than projected, and the recovery in 1964 was incomplete. A slot car racing venture was consuming development resources without generating the returns that had been promised. The Bond tie-in products were sitting in distribution warehouses at volumes that made the accountants uncomfortable. And the core Erector set business, the product that had built everything, the product that carried the company's entire identity, was being squeezed from both sides simultaneously. From above, television advertising had made reaching children prohibitively expensive in ways that print never had been. A full-page spread in a national magazine had once been sufficient to drive Christmas sales. Television required budgets that Gilbert's margin structure could not support, at the scale that Mattel and Hasbro were deploying. The company was being outspent in the living rooms of America by competitors who had restructured their entire cost models around plastic and television. From below, the discount retailers were demanding lower price points. That Gilbert's manufacturing process, precision metal stamping, American labor, quality control standards that had been set by a man who believed his products were nation-building tools, could not deliver without gutting the product itself. The company tried. Cheaper configurations were introduced. Smaller sets at lower price points appeared in the catalog alongside the traditional red metal boxes. Each compromise was individually defensible. Collectively, they were eroding the one thing that had always justified the premium price: the absolute certainty that a Gilbert product was the best version of what it claimed to be. By 1965, the halls of science were all closed. The Brantford facility had been wound down. The workforce at Erector Square, which had stood at 5,000 at its peak, had been reduced to a fraction of that number. The birthday handshakes were a memory. The founder was 4 years dead. The heir was 1 year dead. The management was in Los Angeles, and the factory on Peck Street was running on institutional momentum. The accumulated habit of production that keeps a company moving forward even after the animating force behind it has gone. Walter Janser, one of the last employees still working inside the complex, would later describe those final years with the quiet precision of someone who had watched something die slowly and had no power to stop it. He had worked at the factory for decades. He knew the buildings the way a person knows a childhood home. Which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, where the light came through in the afternoon. In the dissolution that followed the bankruptcy, abandoned in the empty rooms alongside broken machinery and obsolete tooling, he found 5 large scrapbooks. A press clipping service had assembled them across the years 1955 to 1963, the last act of the Gilbert Company, documented in newsprint and quietly forgotten. Maybe he kept them, because someone had to. The Christmas season of 1966 was the last one the company would run. The orders were thin, the lines were reduced. The trucks still left Peck Street on schedule, carrying Gilbert products to stores that were already allocating more shelf space to competitors. In the break rooms and on the factory floor, the workers talked in the careful, indirect way that people talk when they know something is wrong but have not yet been told officially. They were waiting. They did not have long to wait. It was not even Rather's mismanagement. Though that mismanagement had prevented the wound from healing, it was all of it together, arriving at once, in a company that had lost the one thing it needed most. The man who had believed in it enough to hold it together was gone, and without that belief, the bolts had nothing left to hold. The bankruptcy filing came in January 1967. There was no dramatic announcement, no all-hands meeting in the factory courtyard, No speech from a executive flown in from Los Angeles to deliver the news in person. The legal machinery of insolvency does not operate with ceremony. Papers were filed. The company's assets were placed under the control of Walter E. Heller and Company, a financial firm tasked with managing the liquidation. The workers at Erector Square learned what had happened, the way workers usually know these things, through rumors that turned out to be true, through official notices posted on bulletin boards, through the particular silence that falls over a factory floor when everyone knows the conversation they are not having. The machines stopped, not gradually, not with a scheduled wind-down that allowed for dignity and transition. The production lines that had run continuously since 1923, through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through the post-war boom and the space race, and every Christmas season in between, simply ceased. The conveyor belts went still. The steel parts sat in their bins. The red metal boxes waited in stacks for an assembly process that was not coming. The workers collected what they were owed and left. Some had been there for decades. Dominic Pretier had spent 15 years in the shipping department, working alongside a man who shook his hand every birthday and never talked down to him. He walked out of Erector Square for the last time in his work clothes, carrying whatever a man carries when the place he has spent 15 years of his life closes around him. He was not unique. There were hundreds like him, machinists and assemblers and quality control workers and shipping clerks, men and women who had built careers inside those 8 buildings on Peck Street and were now being asked to build something else, somewhere else, with no particular guidance about where to start. New Haven absorbed the blow in the way that mid-sized American cities absorb industrial closures, slowly, imperfectly, and with consequences that lasted far longer than the initial shock. The neighborhoods around Erector Square, calibrated to the rhythms of the factory, lost their anchor. The local businesses that had timed their operations to the Gilbert shifts lost their customer base. The civic pride that had attached itself to being the city where the Erector set was made, where the toy that trained America's engineers was born and built and shipped out to the world, became quietly and without ceremony past tense. The assets were divided with the cold efficiency of liquidation. The Erector set rights were sold to Gabriel Industries. Gabriel's plan was straightforward: replace the steel parts with plastic, reduce the cost, and move the product into the discount retail channels that Gilbert had been unable to reach at its original press point. The red metal boxes disappeared. The precision-stamped steel girders were replaced with injection-molded plastic components that could be assembled without a wrench. The product that had been explicitly designed to teach children how real engineering materials behaved, how steel held tension, how bolts created rigid joints, how a motor transferred energy through a mechanical system, was rebuilt in a material that taught none of those things. It sold adequately for a while, then it faded. Gabriel eventually discontinued it. American Flyer went to Lionel. The company that had been Gilbert's chief rival in the model train market for 30 years absorbed his greatest product line with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a predator that has simply outlasted its competition. The trains still run today, carrying the Lionel name, their Gilbert origins reduced to a footnote in the collector literature. The Gilbert name itself survived on Gabriel's packaging until 1976. Then it disappeared from retail shelves entirely, 9 years after the factory that had made it meaningful closed its doors. By early 1968, the A.C. Gilbert Company was formally dissolved. Walter Janser stayed, not as an employee. There was no longer a company to employ him, but as a caretaker. He tended the boilers that kept the empty buildings from deteriorating through the New Haven winters. He walked the floors of the 8 structures that had once housed 5,000 workers, and now housed nothing but the echo of what they had been. He had found the scrapbooks, that he had preserved them. He understood, perhaps, better than anyone still connected to the site, that something had happened on Peck Street that deserved to be remembered. The question was whether anyone outside New Haven would remember it. The answer, it turned out, depended entirely on what you had found under your Christmas tree as a child, and whether you still remembered the specific weight of a red metal box, and the smell of machine oil, and the feeling of turning a bolt tight with a small steel wrench, and knowing that the thing you were building, piece by careful piece, was real. The dispersal of a company's assets is a clinical process. Accounts assign values, lawyers file documents, a judge signs orders. The physical objects, the machinery, the tooling, the inventory, the buildings themselves, are transferred to new owners who have no particular attachment to what those objects represented to the people who worked with them every day. What happened to the pieces of A.C. Gilbert after January 1967 followed that pattern precisely, and the specific destinations of those pieces tell a story about what America's toy industry was becoming in the years after Gilbert's collapse. A story that is, in its own way, as instructive as the collapse itself. The Erector set went to Gabriel Industries. Gabriel was not an engineering company. It was not built on the conviction that children deserved precision-manufactured tools for learning how the physical world worked. It was a toy company operating in the discount retail environment that had helped kill Gilbert in the first place, and it approached the Erector set the way that environment demanded, as a product to be made cheaper, faster, and more accessible to a market that was increasingly choosing price over quality. The steel parts became plastic. The bolts and wrenches that had made the Erector set genuinely instructive, that had required a child to develop actual mechanical skill to use, were replaced with snap-together components that required nothing of the child beyond enthusiasm. The red metal boxes, those heavy, satisfying containers that generations of American boys had opened on Christmas morning, with the particular reverence reserved for something serious, became cardboard. The product sold. For a while, then CBS Toys acquired it, then Gav Viewmaster, then Ideal Toys. The brand passed through corporate hands like an object no one quite knew what to do with, but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. Each new owner simplified it further. Each simplification moved it further from the thing that had made it worth owning in the first place. In 1990, the French company Meccano purchased the Erector brand and consolidated it with its own construction toy line. The product that Alfred Carlton Gilbert had invented by staring out a train window at steel girders in 1911 was now a European brand, manufactured overseas, sold in American stores under the name Erector by Meccano. It exists in that form today. American Flyer fared no better in spirit, if somewhat better in continuity. Lionel absorbed the line in 1967 and has carried it forward ever since. The trains still run. Collectors still seek out the original Gilbert-era American Flyer sets with the devotion that the secondary market prices reflect clearly. Original Gilbert sets from the late 1940s and 1950s command significant premiums precisely because collectors understand the difference between what Gilbert made and what came after. The chemistry sets, the microscope kits, the telescope sets, the science toys that had filled the catalogs of the most ambitious educational toy company in American history, these found no single buyer. They scattered. Some lines were picked up briefly by smaller manufacturers and discontinued within years. Others simply ceased to exist. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Laboratory, that extraordinary and genuinely dangerous artifact of a more confident scientific era, became a museum piece. Original sets now sell at auction for thousands of dollars. The patents, more than 150 of them, covering everything from motor designs to construction toy geometries, were absorbed into the portfolios of various acquiring companies and largely forgotten. The enameled wire patent that had made Gilbert the largest manufacturer of fractional horsepower motors in America expired into the public domain. The Gilbert Hall of Science in New York City, that monument to the idea that science belonged to everyone, had already closed by 1966. The building found other tenants. The mission found no successor. What the liquidation revealed, in the aggregate, was something that the individual transactions obscured. The A.C. Gilbert Company had not simply been a collection of products and patents and factory equipment. It had been a coherent argument about what children deserved, about what learning looked like, about what American manufacturing could mean when it was driven by conviction rather than margin. That argument could not be transferred in a bankruptcy proceeding. It had lived in the man who made it, and it had died with him. What remained was inventory. The buildings did not come down. That is the first thing worth saying about what became of Erector Square after the bankruptcy. In most American cities, when a factory of that size closes, the structures follow within a generation, demolished for redevelopment or left to deteriorate until demolition becomes the only option. The 8 buildings on Peck Street survived. Walter Janser made sure of that. For years after the company dissolved, Janser remained on site, tending the boilers through the New Haven winters, walking the empty floors, keeping the heat running in buildings that no longer had a reason to be heated, beyond the simple fact that someone who cared about them had not yet left. He was one of the last men standing from the Gilbert era, and he treated the buildings the way a person treats a grave, with the quiet, undemonstrative respect of someone who understands that what is being preserved matters, even if he cannot fully articulate why. He had found the scrapbooks in the dissolution, 5 large volumes assembled by a press clipping service, documenting the Gilbert Company's final years from 1955 to 1963, the last act of an American institution, recorded in newsprint and left behind in an empty room. Janser took them. He understood that someone outside the walls of Erector Square needed to know what had happened inside them. Those scrapbooks eventually found their way to the Eli Whitney Museum in Hamden, Connecticut, which today houses one of the most extensive collections of A.C. Gilbert Company artifacts in existence. The museum sits on the site of Eli Whitney's original gun factory, a building dedicated to American manufacturing innovation, preserving the legacy of a toy company that had argued for 54 years that innovation and play were the same thing. The Peck Street complex itself was gradually repurposed across the following decades into what it is today, one of the largest artist studio complexes in the northeastern United States. More than 175 studios now occupy the 8 buildings, housing painters, sculptors, musicians, architects, designers, and theater companies. The neighborhood is still called Erector Square. The name never changed. There is something fitting about that transformation, and something painful about it simultaneously. The buildings that once housed the production lines of America's most ambitious educational toy company now house people who make things with their hands, artists, craftspeople, designers, who work in the same spaces where machinists once stood and stamped steel and assembled motors and packed red metal boxes for Christmas. The impulse is recognizable. The scale is different. The economic gravity that once made Erector Square the organizing center of an entire neighborhood is gone, replaced by the lighter, more fragile economy of creative wunk. A theater company called the Broken Umbrella staged a production about A.C. Gilbert inside Building 5. The actors performed on the same floors where Gilbert's workers had once stood. One of the production's designers, preparing the set, found herself thinking about fidelity, whether she was being true to what Gilbert had put into the world. She was asking the right question. The ghost of Erector Square is not a haunting. It is a standard. The man who built those buildings believed that the things made inside them mattered. Walking those floors today, that belief is still present. In the architecture, in the name on the street signs, in the weight of what was lost, and what, against reasonable expectation, endured. The patents, more than 150 of them, covering everything from motor designs to construction toy geometries, were absorbed into the portfolios of various acquiring companies and largely forgotten. The enameled wire patent that had made Gilbert the largest manufacturer of fractional horsepower motors in America expired into the public domain. The Gilbert Hall of Science in New York City, that monument to the idea that science belonged to everyone, had already closed by 1966. The building found other tenants. The mission found no successor. What the liquidation revealed, in the aggregate, was something that the individual transactions obscured. The A.C. Gilbert Company had not simply been a collection of products and patents and factory equipment. It had been a coherent argument about what children deserved, about what learning looked like, about what American manufacturing could mean when it was driven by conviction rather than margin. That argument could not be transferred in a bankruptcy proceeding. It had lived in the man who made it, and it had died with him. What remained was inventory. There is a generation of American men, now in their 60s and 70s, who remember the red metal box. Not as a concept, not as a historical artifact, as a physical memory. The specific weight of it when you lifted it off the floor on Christmas morning. The sound the latch made when you opened it. The smell of machine oil and steel that rose from the parts inside. The small wrench. The bolts in their sorted compartments. The diagram of the thing you were going to build, folded carefully into the lid. That memory is not nostalgia for a toy. It is nostalgia for a particular kind of confidence. The confidence that a child feels when an adult hands him something serious and says without condescension that he is capable of figuring it out. Alfred Carlton Gilbert spent 54 years manufacturing that confidence at scale. He put it in a red metal box and shipped it to every corner of America. And the children who received it grew up to build the highways and the power grids and the rockets and the computers that define the second half of the 20th century. The connection is not metaphorical. It is documented in the careers of the Apollo engineers and the infrastructure designers and the manufacturing executives who cite, when asked about their origins, a childhood spent with an Erecta set on the living room floor. What was lost in January 1967 was not a company. Companies close, markets shift, products become obsolete. These are ordinary facts of economic life, and they carry no particular moral weight on their own. What was lost was the institutional embodiment of an argument, the argument that children deserve tools, not just entertainment, that the difference between building something and watching something is not a matter of preference, but of development. That a nation which hands its children steel and bolts and a diagram is making a different investment than a nation which hands them a screen. Gilbert made that argument with erector sets, and chemistry kits and microscope sets, and the Gilbert Hall of Science, and 5,000 jobs on Peck Street, and a handshake on every worker's birthday. He made it before the Council of National Defense in Washington in 1918, and he made it in the pages of Popular Mechanics in 1952, and he made it every Christmas season for half a century. In the language that markets understand, product, price, distribution, demand. The argument did not die because it was wrong. The engineers who walked on the moon 2 years after the factory closed were proof that it was right. It died because the men who inherited it did not understand what they had inherited, because a culture cannot be transferred in a stock transaction. Because conviction, when it leaves a room, does not automatically return when new management arrives. The machines on Peck Street are gone, the red metal boxes are gone, the birthday handshakes are gone. But somewhere in America tonight, in a garage or an attic or a carefully maintained display case, there is an original A.C. Gilbert erector set in its original box. The bolts are sorted, the wrench is where it belongs, the diagram is folded into the lid, waiting for a child who is capable of figuring it out. Gilbert believed there would always be that child. On that point at least, he was not wrong. The patents, more than 150 of them, covering everything from motor designs to construction toy geometries, were absorbed into the portfolios of various acquiring companies and largely forgotten. The enameled wire patent that had made Gilbert the largest manufacturer of fractional horsepower motors in America expired into the public domain. The Gilbert Hall of Science in New York City, that monument to the idea that science belonged to everyone, had already closed by 1966. The building found other tenants. The mission found no successor. What the liquidation revealed, in the aggregate, was something that the individual transactions obscured. The A.C. Gilbert Company had not simply been a collection of products and patents and factory equipment. It had been a coherent argument about what children deserved, about what learning looked like, about what American manufacturing could mean when it was driven by conviction rather than margin. That argument could not be transferred in a bankruptcy proceeding. It had lived in the man who made it, and it had died with him. What remained was inventory.